You ever wonder why companies recall a product? Or why would they make something they know is bad? The answer is very simple. It's actually cheaper for them to make the product and then bring it back later and fix it than it is to have the factory sit idle. During the time period we've been talking about, workers started looking for a way to improve their lives. And what they learned was one of the few resources they had was themselves. They couldn't really do anything, though, unless they united and got together. So what were the conditions that workers faced during this time period? First of all, long days and long weeks. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Comes out to 72 hours. Our max work week today is 40. Moving parts of the machines were right out in the open and there was no safety equipment. And it was dangerous to work in these factories. In 1882, for example, 675 people died at work every week. Thousands more would have been injured, in many cases permanently to the point where they couldn't work. If you're hurt so bad you couldn't work, you simply got fired. You got no compensation, you got no help from the company. Now you might think there'd be a great reward for all this, but there really wasn't. Men made an average of just under $500 a year. Women made an average of $250, children a little bit under $200. A couple looks at conditions here. We have a blacksmith shop. And again, you'll notice all of the moving parts of this machine are right there in the open for you to accidentally walk into, lean on, stumble into, whatever the case may be. As you can see from the men standing next to this thing, that would be a catastrophic accident. These are children working in a textile mill. And a couple of things for you to notice here. Number one, they're not wearing shoes. Number two, they are standing on the machine among the moving parts. These kids are probably about 9, 10 years old. Just imagine for a second, they get tired, they get careless as kids do. Not hard to see how a terrible accident might happen there. Here is the safety officer of a factory. You'll notice he is very interested in the safety of his workers. View of a shoe factory. And just to notice here is really the giant room with no ventilation. Those windows are essentially closed. So it would be hot in the summer. It would be dusty. It would smell. People would get sick in there. So on down the line. So the response of workers then was to unionize. And one of the earliest is called the National Labor Union. This is one of the first large-scale unions. They wanted to unionize everybody, no matter what they did. So whether you were skilled or unskilled, whether you were in construction, whether you worked in the cities, whether you worked in the country, they wanted you in this union because they understood the more people they have, the more power they have. Where the National Labor Union existed, an 8-hour workday became the norm versus the 12 we looked at earlier. Another early union was the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor were a secret society. Now, the reason for that was, in many places, it was actually illegal to join a union. So, in order to stay out of jail, number one, and number two, not be beat up by the company's so-called security force, they kept it a secret. Their two big things were equal pay for equal work. So, in other words, men and women should get paid the same salary for doing the same job, and anti-child labor. Now, did they care about women and children? Absolutely. But their real goal was to force the companies to hire more men. Remember, this is still a very male-centered nation at this point in time. From the Knights of Labor, we move on to what are called craft unions. A craft union brings together all of these skilled workers in an industry. Skilled worker is somebody that does something that has to require special training, something that not everybody can do. The craft unions were very important to people because machines were starting to replace skilled workers. The skilled workers were worried about their loss of livelihood and wanted to make sure that they could force companies to still employ them. On the other side, we had what were called industrial unions. Industrial unions wanted to bring together all of the workers in an industry, whether they were skilled or unskilled. An early industrial union was the American Railway Union. They wanted everybody that worked on the railroad, from the people that built the tracks, to the people who cleaned the passenger cars, to the people who actually drove the trains. Okay? Whatever you did in the railroad, they wanted you in this union. Because again, they understood the more people they had, the more power they had. Something that moved into the American Union movement that ended up hurting it was called socialism. Socialism is where the government controls business, property, and wealth. And to a socialist, the problem in labor is capitalism. Remember, the goal is to make a profit. So in capitalism, my goal as an owner, which is to make as much money as I can, goes against your goal as a worker, which is to make as much money as you can. Somebody's got to lose. Socialists would say the owners always win. So the solution is make the government the owner so they're not worried about making a profit. This became very popular in Europe. However, here in the United States, socialism has always been wildly unpopular. Reason for that is we were founded on the belief that whatever a person makes working belongs to him or her. So the idea of somebody taking my money and giving it to somebody else was particularly offensive to a lot of Americans, including the poor working class Americans, even though it would have benefited them greatly. An example of a socialist union was the International Workers of the World. Take a look at their banner here. Red is the international color of communism/socialism. If you take a look here, it says freedom from wage slavery. The IWW is a very radical union. Among other things, they were not opposed to overthrowing the government. And this kind of talk really frightened a lot of Americans. What happened was the few socialists and IWW types in the union movement were seen by the public as representing all of the union movement. So that really took away a lot of the support people might have given to the workers otherwise. Other events went against the union movement as well. A railroad strike in 1877 went nationwide. Word of it literally spread down the tracks. And as the railroad workers ran out of money, the strike then turned violent. Other strikes in Pittsburgh and in Pullman, Illinois turned violent to the point where troops had to be sent in. And once again, Americans, being very orderly people, didn't like this. So that turned public opinion against the unions as well. However, 1911, there would be one event that would change things. Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. In this brick building in New York City, the building was supposedly fireproof. Fire broke out in a factory that made shirts. Now, even though the building was fireproof, it didn't burn down. Everything inside was very flammable. So what happened was the doors were locked. The fire escapes were broken. And this is what the inside of the building looked like after the fire. As you can imagine, it got tremendously hot in there. As people couldn't escape, they turned to a very last resort. They jumped out the windows. Now they're 9, 10 floors up. They jumped out the windows. People were trying to hold out sheets and so forth for them. But unfortunately, a lot of people missed the sheets and fell to their death. This outraged the public and began to stir up some sympathy for the union movement, especially in the nation's larger cities. Despite the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire and its publicity, it was still very hard to organize a union. Some companies made workers sign what's called a yellow dog contract. The contract was a legally binding statement that they would never join a union. If they did, they could be fired. Secondly, an anti-monopoly law called the Sherman Antitrust Act was totally twisted around and used against unions, claiming they were trying to form a monopoly of workers. Finally, the public remained unsympathetic. A lot of the workers were poor, they were immigrants, they were a part of society that the wealthier people in America, even the middle class, preferred not to think about. People didn't necessarily care about the conditions of the workers. However, they got extremely irritated when strikes disrupted their lives. So those things would continue to make it hard to form unions all the way up into the world wars where labor was generally needed. So 3 things to remember from this section. Number 1, workers formed unions in response to poor wages, hours, and working conditions. Number 2, factories that were unionized saw dramatic improvements in wages, hours, and conditions. And finally, workers faced a great number of difficulties in forming and maintaining unions. That's all for now. We'll see you next time.